The morning Catherine Thornhill decided to destroy her life. The sky over the Scottish Highlands was the color of old iron. She stood at the window of Glenross Estate, her mother's voice slicing through the morning air like a whip crack. Another suitor was arriving, the fourth this month. This one was different, her mother Emily insisted with breathless enthusiasm. This one owned half of Scotland's textile mills and had already buried 2 wives, which meant he understood the value of a well-bred woman who knew when to stay silent. Catherine felt bile rise in her throat. She was 24 years old and she was running out of time. In her world, that meant she was running out of worth. Her father had been dead for 2 years, and with him had gone any pretense that the Thornhill family was anything more than a gilded name wrapped around a mountain of debt. The estate was mortgaged to the hilt. The staff had been reduced to a cook, a housekeeper, and a groundskeeper who was almost certainly selling off the silver piece by piece. Her mother's solution was elegant and ruthless. Marry money. Marry it quickly. Marry it before the bank seized the property and the neighbors started their gleeful whispering. Catherine had endured 3 men parading through their sitting room in as many weeks, men with manicured hands and predatory eyes, men who assessed her the way her father had once evaluated livestock at market, checking her posture and her teeth and her potential for producing heirs. The last one, Lord Ashcroft, had actually asked Emily whether Catherine was prone to hysteria before he'd bothered addressing Catherine directly. She had smiled graciously through the entire humiliation, her face muscles screaming in protest, while something inside her began to fracture. That night, alone in her father's abandoned library, Catherine made a decision that would have sent every woman in her social circle reaching for their smelling salts. She was going to marry someone completely unsuitable, someone poor, someone so far beneath her station that Emily would have no choice but to cut her loose entirely. She would ruin herself deliberately, strategically, and in doing so, she would finally breathe. The plan was desperate and possibly deranged, but Catherine had inherited her father's iron will along with his catastrophic debts, and once the idea took root in her mind, it grew like thornwood, impossible to uproot. She spent 3 sleepless nights pacing her bedroom until the floorboards groaned, working out every detail. She would need to find someone quickly, someone with no connection to Edinburgh society, a laborer perhaps, or a tradesman, someone decent enough not to abuse her, but poor enough to horrify Emily into complete disownment. Fate, as it happened, had crueler plans. On a frozen Monday morning, Catherine wrapped herself in her plainest traveling cloak and slipped out of Glenross Estate before dawn. She told no one where she was going, because no one would have permitted it. The village of Brar was 5 miles down the rutted estate road, far enough from the manor that she could move without immediate recognition. She had visited only once before, for her father's funeral procession, but she remembered it as a place where people worked with their hands and cared little for titles. The walk took longer than she had anticipated. Her boots, designed for drawing rooms and garden promenades, were useless against the frozen highland mud of February. By the time she reached the village outskirts, her feet were numb and her breath came in white clouds. The main square was quiet, just a handful of shopkeepers opening their doors and a farmer wrestling a stubborn mule toward the market. Catherine stood at the square's edge, suddenly paralyzed by the absurdity of her own plan. What was she supposed to do? Approach a stranger and propose marriage? Ask the butcher if he was interested in a bankrupt aristocrat with no dowry and a mother who would curse his bloodline for generations? She was about to retreat when she heard a commotion near the village fountain. A man crouched there, hunched over a wooden bowl, eating something with his bare hands. His coat was more holes than fabric, his beard was a wild tangle that hadn't seen scissors in months, and his hair stuck out at mad angles like he'd been sleeping in ditches. He looked up as Catherine approached, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. Scars crossed his left cheek in pale lines. His eyes were the color of winter seawater, startling blue-gray and far too alert for someone who looked half-starved. There was something unsettling in those eyes, something that had seen things Catherine couldn't imagine and hadn't forgotten a single detail. When he smiled at her, a strange, too wide grin that didn't quite reach those watchful eyes, Catherine felt her heart hammer against her ribs. He looked like a beggar. He looked like a madman. He looked exactly like someone Emily would rather die than acknowledge as family. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Catherine did something she would never be able to fully justify, not even to herself. She stepped forward, her courage and terror running in equal measure through her veins, and she spoke. "Excuse me, are you married?" The man blinked, his strange grin faltering into confusion. Up close, she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the way his shoulders tensed as though bracing for a blow. He looked at her like she might be a fever dream conjured by hunger and cold. "I beg your pardon?" Catherine's hands trembled inside her cloak, but her voice emerged steadier than she felt. "I need to know if you're married. It's important." The man stared at her for 3 full heartbeats, his expression cycling between bewilderment and suspicion. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No, I'm not." Catherine took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass. "Good," she said, "because I have a proposition for you." The man didn't laugh, which Catherine took as a small miracle. He remained crouched by the fountain, one scarred hand still gripping his wooden bowl, studying her with the kind of careful intensity usually reserved for dangerous animals. His eyes moved from her face to her cloak, taking in the fine wool she had tried to disguise with road dust, the posture that betrayed years of deportment instruction, even as she attempted to appear ordinary. "A proposition," he repeated, his voice rough like gravel underfoot. It wasn't a question, it was the sound of someone who had heard many propositions in his life, none of them good. Catherine felt heat flood her cheeks despite the February cold. This was madness. She knew it was madness. But turning back now meant returning to Glen Ross, to Emily's ambitions, to Lord Ashcroft's tobacco-stained fingers, and the slow suffocation of becoming someone else's possession. "I need to marry someone," she said, forcing herself to hold his unnerving gaze. "Quickly, someone who won't ask questions or expect anything beyond a legal arrangement. In return, I can offer you a modest sum, not much, but enough to eat properly for several months, perhaps find work somewhere new." The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind those pale eyes. He glanced past her, scanning the square as if checking for witnesses, or perhaps looking for whoever sent this clearly deranged woman to torment him. When he looked back at her, there was something harder in his face. "You're serious?" "Completely." "You're running from something." It wasn't a question. Catherine answered anyway. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Catherine became aware of how loud her own heartbeat sounded in her ears. A cart clattered past behind them. Somewhere, a rooster crowed. The ordinary sounds of a village morning while she stood in the middle of it, asking a complete stranger to upend both their lives. "What's your name?" he asked finally. Catherine hesitated. Giving her real name meant risk, but lying seemed a poor foundation for an arrangement built on mutual desperation. "Catherine Thornhill." She watched his face carefully for recognition, for the change that always came when people heard the Thornhill name. But there was nothing. Either he didn't know the family or he didn't care. Both possibilities felt like relief. "William," he said, and that strange grin flickered back across his face for just a moment. "William Fraser. And I think you should go home, Miss Thornhill. Whatever you're running from, marriage to a beggar with nothing but the clothes on his back isn't going to save you." The rejection stung more sharply than Catherine expected. She had prepared herself for suspicion, even mockery, but not for gentle dismissal, not for someone to look at her desperate plan and try to protect her from it. "You don't understand," she said, and hated how her voice wavered.
Going home isn't an option. My mother is determined to auction me off to the highest bidder, and I won't do it. I won't spend my life as some old man's decorative investment. If I marry you, marry anyone she considers unsuitable, she'll wash her hands of me entirely. I'll be disowned, but I'll be free." William shifted his weight, wincing slightly, and Catherine noticed the way he favored his left leg, some old injury making itself known. "And what happens to you after that, when you're disowned and married to a man who sleeps in barns? Have you thought about what freedom costs when you can't even afford bread?" "I've thought about it every night for 3 weeks," Catherine said, and the honesty of it rang in the cold air between them. "I know what I'm asking. I know how it sounds, but I also know that if I don't do something now, I'll wake up one morning 20 years from now in a house I hate, married to a man I despise, wondering when exactly I stopped being a person and became a thing to be managed." William studied her for a long moment, and Catherine found herself unable to look away from those unsettling eyes. There was something ancient in them, a weariness that had nothing to do with age. She wondered what happened to put those scars on his face, what happened to put that careful watchfulness in his gaze. "I can't give you the life you're used to," he said quietly. "I have a cottage on a hillside outside the village. No servants, no comforts, barely enough to keep the rain out. That's not freedom, Miss Thornhill. That's just a different kind of prison." "It's my choice of prison. That's the difference." Something flickered across William's scarred face. Recognition, perhaps. Respect. He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and dirt embedded in the creases of his palms. Catherine saw him weighing something she couldn't name. "Why me?" he asked. "There are other men in this village, men who might jump at the chance to marry a Thornhill, even a disgraced one." Catherine had asked herself the same question in the 30 seconds since she'd first seen him crouched by the fountain. The truth was instinctual and impossible to articulate. Something about the way he held himself, the way he hadn't looked at her like a puzzle to solve or a prize to claim, the exhaustion in his shoulders that matched the exhaustion in her chest. Because you look like someone who understands what it means to want out," she said simply. William met her eyes, and for the first time something almost like a real smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was gone before Catherine could be certain she'd seen it, but it left behind a warmth she felt in her frozen fingers. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it properly. Legal documents, witnesses, a real marriage in the eyes of the law and the church, even if it's an empty arrangement. I won't have you trapped in something you can't escape if things go wrong." Catherine felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't realized had been clenched tight since her father's funeral. Agreed. William held out his hand, rough, scarred, and surprisingly steady. Catherine took it, and despite the February cold, his grip was warm. "Then I suppose we're getting married, Lady Catherine." She smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. "Just Catherine," she said. "I'm about to lose the title anyway." The wedding took place 4 days later in a stone church so small it could barely hold 20 people. Catherine wore a simple dress of deep green wool, borrowed from the village seamstress who had taken pity on her story, or at least the edited version Catherine had constructed. William stood beside her in clothes that had been cleaned and mended, though they still hung loose on his lean frame. His wild beard had been trimmed just enough to look marginally civilized. The priest, an elderly man with gentle eyes and trembling hands, spoke the words that would bind them together, and Catherine felt the strange weight of it settle over her shoulders like a mantle. When William slipped the ring onto her finger, a plain silver band he'd purchased from the village blacksmith, Catherine noticed his hands weren't shaking at all. Hers were. They walked out of the church into afternoon sunlight that felt impossibly bright. Catherine had written her mother a single letter, delivered that morning, explaining in precise and unapologetic terms what she had done. She imagined Emily reading it over breakfast, the teacup shattering against the floor, the shrieking that would rattle every window at Glenross Estate. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like exhaling after holding her breath for years. William's cottage was exactly as he had described it, small, isolated, perched on a hillside overlooking a valley that stretched towards mountains still capped with snow. The roof didn't leak badly, just in one corner that William had marked with a battered tin bucket. There was a stone fireplace, a wooden table with two mismatched chairs, and a narrow bed that William immediately insisted Catherine take while he fashioned himself a pallet by the hearth. "We had an agreement," he said when she protested. "A legal marriage, but not that kind. You keep the bed. I'll manage fine." Catherine wanted to argue, but the exhaustion of the past few days caught up with her at once, and she simply nodded. The first week passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. William woke before dawn and worked on repairs to the cottage that Catherine suspected he was inventing to stay busy. She learned to cook simple meals over the fire, burning more than she succeeded at first, but gradually finding a competence she never needed in her old life. They spoke politely to each other, like cordial strangers sharing a carriage, never quite sure how much honesty the situation allowed. But at night, Catherine would wake to hear William gasping in nightmares that made him call out names she didn't recognize. And in the firelight, she would see the scars on his hands, on his face, and wonder exactly what she had invited into her new life, and who William Fraser really was.
If you love stories of dukes, secrets, and forbidden love, please like, subscribe, and stay with us.
Catherine had learned to recognize the sound of her mother's ambition. It came in the rustle of expensive letter paper being unfolded at breakfast, the sharp intake of breath that meant another possibility had surfaced, another man with money and need had been identified in Emily's relentless campaign. The parade had started 3 weeks after her father's funeral, before the black crepe had even been removed from the mirrors. Lord Ashcroft had been first, 62 years old, with fingers stained yellow from tobacco and a laugh that sounded like gravel scraping stone. He'd circled Catherine in the drawing room as if inspecting a mare at Tattersall's, commenting on her posture and the width of her hips with the casual authority of a man who believed women existed primarily as vessels for producing heirs. Emily had served him her best tea and smiled encouragingly, while Catherine sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling something inside her begin to calcify. Sir William Pembroke had been next, younger, only 45, which Emily presented as if it were a tremendous gift. He'd brought his solicitor to tea, a thin man with spectacles who had actually produced documents outlining the financial arrangements of the proposed marriage before Pembroke had bothered asking Catherine a single question about herself. They'd discussed her as if she weren't sitting 3 feet away, using words like settlement and reproductive capacity and acceptable losses in reference to her father's debts. Catherine had excused herself halfway through and vomited in the hallway bathroom, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the tap. The third suitor, Lord Carrington, had been the worst. He'd arrived with his adult son from his first marriage, a pale young man who looked at Catherine with something approaching pity. Carrington himself had barely spoken to her, directing all his questions to Emily as if Catherine were a painting whose value needed to be appraised rather than a person with thoughts and preferences. He'd asked to see her teeth, actually asked in the middle of the sitting room with the afternoon light streaming through the windows if he might examine her teeth to ensure they were sound. Emily had laughed as if he'd made a charming joke and encouraged Catherine to smile. Catherine had smiled and smiled and smiled until her face felt like a mask that might crack and fall away in pieces. That night, staring at her reflection in her bedroom mirror, Catherine had barely recognized the woman looking back at her. When had her eyes become so empty? When had she learned to disappear while still remaining visible? Emily's solution was surgical in its simplicity. Marry money quickly, before the creditors seized Glenross entirely. Marry it decisively, before Catherine aged past the point where desperation might be mistaken for choice.
The men didn't matter, their characters were irrelevant, their treatment of previous wives was merely history. What mattered was solvency. What mattered was preserving the Thornhill name, even if that meant selling the last Thornhill daughter to whichever bidder could afford the entry price. Catherine understood the mathematics perfectly. She was 24, unmarried, and attached to a bankrupt estate. In her mother's ledger, she had already depreciated past the point of being an asset. Now she was simply inventory that needed to be moved before it spoiled entirely. The fourth suitor was arriving tomorrow. Emily had been humming all morning. Catherine had until sunrise to disappear. Catherine woke at 4 in the morning, though waking implied she'd been sleeping. She'd spent the night listening to the house settle around her, counting her heartbeats, rehearsing the moment she would stop being Lady Catherine Thornhill and become something else entirely. She dressed in the dark, her hands surprisingly steady. The plainest dress she owned, a wool traveling cloak that had belonged to her grandmother, a small purse containing everything she'd managed to save from her monthly allowance over the past year. £43, 6 shillings. Enough to convince a poor man that marrying her might be worth the trouble. The hallway outside her room was silent. Emily's bedroom door remained closed, and Catherine moved past it with the careful steps of someone who had learned to be invisible in her own home. Down the servants' staircase, through the kitchen where the banked fire still held faint warmth, out the side door that no one had oiled in months and that screamed on its hinges like an alarm. Catherine froze, waiting for footsteps, for her mother's voice calling her back. But the house remained quiet, and after 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, she stepped into the pre-dawn darkness and pulled the door shut behind her. The cold hit her immediately. February in the Highlands was unforgiving, and the sky above Glenross was still black, starless, heavy with the promise of more snow. Catherine's breath came out in white clouds as she hurried down the gravel drive, her boots crunching too loudly in the frozen silence. She'd worn her drawing-room boots, soft leather things designed for taking tea and strolling through manicured gardens. By the time she reached the main road, she'd already realized her mistake. The road to Brar was rutted and frozen, the mud from yesterday's thaw having hardened overnight into ridges that caught at her feet with every step. Within 10 minutes, her toes had gone numb. Within 20, she'd turned her ankle twice on hidden stones and felt the first blister forming on her left heel. She kept walking. The sky began to lighten incrementally, black fading to deep blue, then gray that made the landscape visible in stages. Hills emerged first, then the skeletal shapes of bare trees, then finally the road itself stretching ahead of her like a ribbon of frozen misery. Catherine's legs burned. Her feet had progressed past pain into a distant numbness that worried her more than the blisters. The cloak kept her torso warm, but did nothing for her exposed hands, which had turned red and then white in the biting wind. She thought about turning back. The thought came and went like a fever dream, tempting and terrible. She could return to Glenross before Emily woke, slip back into her room, pretend this night had never happened, meet the fourth suitor tomorrow with a smile that would crack her face in half. She kept walking. When the first buildings of Brar finally appeared on the horizon, Catherine's relief was so acute that it brought tears to her eyes. Or perhaps that was just the wind. She couldn't tell anymore. Her entire body felt like it belonged to someone else, some other woman who was foolish enough to destroy her life before breakfast. The village square was just ahead, smoke rising from chimneys, the ordinary sounds of morning beginning to stir. Catherine limped toward it, her ruined boots leaving uneven tracks in the frost, and wondered if she was about to make the greatest mistake of her life or the first real choice she'd ever made. Possibly both.
The village of Brar looked different at dawn than Catherine remembered. Smaller, somehow. More real. The stone buildings huddled together against the cold, smoke curling from chimneys in thin gray lines. A few shopkeepers were already moving about, sweeping storefronts, arranging goods, performing the mundane rituals of mourning without any awareness that Catherine's entire world was ending 3 feet away from them. She stood at the edge of the square, suddenly paralyzed by the absurdity of what she'd come here to do. In the gray light of morning, her plan seemed less like desperate brilliance and more like the delusion of someone who'd spent too many sleepless nights talking herself into madness. She was about to marry a stranger. She was about to ruin herself on purpose. She was about to trade everything she'd ever known for a freedom that might turn out to be just another kind of cage. Catherine took a breath that hurt her lungs and forced herself to look around the square properly. A farmer loading sacks onto a cart, two women gossiping by the well, a boy chasing a dog between buildings. All potential candidates, and yet none of them felt right in ways Catherine couldn't articulate. Then she saw him. He was crouched by the fountain at the center of the square, hunched over a wooden bowl, eating something with his bare hands. His coat was more patches than original fabric, held together by what looked like determination and prayer. His beard was wild, untrimmed for months at least, and his dark hair stuck out at angles that suggested he'd been sleeping rough. But it was his eyes that stopped Catherine's breath. When he glanced up, perhaps sensing her stare, his eyes were the color of winter seawater, clear and sharp and utterly incongruous with the rest of his appearance. They were the eyes of someone who saw everything and forgot nothing, eyes that had witnessed things Catherine couldn't begin to imagine. His face was scarred, a pale line running along his left cheekbone, and when he noticed her watching, he smiled. It was a strange smile, too wide, too bright, the smile of someone who'd forgotten how the expression was supposed to work. It should have frightened her. Perhaps it did, a little. Catherine's feet moved before her mind could catch up. She crossed the square, aware of the shopkeepers pausing to watch, aware of how she must look with her fine cloak and her desperate eyes. The man didn't stand as she approached, just watched her with that unnerving intensity, his bowl forgotten in his scarred hands. "Excuse me," Catherine heard herself say, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. "Are you married?" The man blinked. His strange smile faltered into confusion, and for a moment Catherine saw something else beneath the wild exterior. Exhaustion, weariness, the careful calculation of someone who'd learned to expect cruelty dressed up as kindness. "I beg your pardon?" His voice was rough, unused, the accent harder to place than she'd expected. Catherine's hands were shaking inside her cloak, but she'd come too far to retreat now. She'd walked 5 miles in boots designed for drawing rooms. She'd left behind everything she'd ever known. She wasn't going to lose her nerve in front of a beggar with seawater eyes. "I need to know if you're married," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "It's important." The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been dark amusement. Then slowly, he shook his head. "No, I'm not." Catherine took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "Good," she said, "because I have a proposition for you." The church was so small, Catherine almost missed it. Tucked between 2 larger buildings on the edge of Beggar, it looked more like an afterthought than a house of God. Stone walls darkened by centuries of highland weather, a wooden door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges, narrow windows that let in more cold than light. Father MacLeod was older than the building itself, or so it seemed. His hands trembled as he opened the parish register, and his eyes were clouded with cataracts that made Catherine wonder if he could actually see her and William standing before him. Perhaps that was a mercy. Perhaps it was better if he couldn't see how William's coat was held together with twine, or how Catherine's expensive cloak clashed violently with the desperation in her eyes. "You have witnesses?" Father MacLeod asked, his voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in his hands. William nodded toward the back of the church, where the village blacksmith and his wife stood looking uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes on a Thursday morning. The blacksmith had been the one to forge the ring, a simple band of silver that William had paid for with coins that looked like they might have been his last. Catherine had watched the transaction through the smithy window, watched William count out the money with careful deliberation, and felt something twist in her chest that she refused to name. "Aye, Father," William said, "we have witnesses." The church was brief, stripped of all ornament and ceremony. Father MacLeod spoke the words in Latin first, then repeated them in English for their benefit, his voice rising and falling in rhythms worn smooth by decades of repetition.
Catherine heard herself respond at the appropriate moments, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else, someone braver or more foolish than she could claim to be. William's responses were quieter, almost reluctant, and Catherine wondered if he was having second thoughts, if he was realizing that 43 pounds wasn't worth shackling himself to a woman who'd walked 5 miles in the wrong boots to destroy her own life. But when Father MacLeod asked if William would take Catherine as his lawfully wedded wife, he said, "I will," without hesitation. The words felt like swallowing glass, sharp and foreign and impossible to take back. When it came time for the ring, William produced it from his coat pocket, the silver catching the dim light filtering through the stained glass. His hands were steady as he slipped it onto Catherine's finger, and she noticed again the calluses, the scars, the evidence of a life lived far from drawing rooms and titled estates. Catherine's hands were shaking. She tried to stop them and couldn't, tried to hide the trembling and failed entirely. The ring was too large, loose enough that she'd need to wear it on her middle finger instead. But she didn't say anything. Complaining about the fit of a wedding ring purchased by a beggar seemed like the height of absurdity. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Father MacLeod said, and closed the parish register with a sound like a door shutting. Catherine was married. She was married to a stranger with wild eyes and a history written in scars across his hands. She was married to a man whose real name she wasn't entirely certain of, whose past was a mystery, whose future was a question mark she just legally attached herself to. The blacksmith and his wife signed the register as witnesses, their signatures careful and labored. William signed next, his handwriting surprisingly elegant for someone who looked like he'd been living in ditches. Catherine signed last, her maiden name for the final time, the letters of Thornhill looking strange and distant on the page. Outside, the afternoon sun was impossibly bright. Catherine stood on the church steps, blinking against the light, and wondered if Emily had discovered her absence yet, wondered if her mother was screaming or weeping, or perhaps celebrating the removal of an inconvenient daughter who'd refused to be sold to the highest bidder. William stood beside her, close enough that she could smell wood smoke and something else, something earthy and undefinable. He didn't touch her, didn't offer his arm, or attempt any gesture of husbandly possession. "Well, I suppose we should go home, Mrs. Fraser." Mrs. Fraser. The name sat strange in Catherine's ears, foreign and permanent. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and followed her husband into her new life.
The cottage was exactly as William had described it, which somehow made it worse. Catherine had spent the entire walk up the hillside hoping he'd been exaggerating, that the reality would be less bleak than his warning. But no, the reality was precisely as bleak as advertised, possibly bleaker. It was small. Not charmingly small, not cozy small, but genuinely uncomfortably small. One room that served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting room, with a narrow bed shoved against the far wall, and a stone fireplace that looked like it had been built sometime during the previous century and not maintained since. The roof sagged in the middle, and there was indeed a bucket positioned in the corner to catch the leak William had mentioned, though currently it sat empty under the gray afternoon light. The windows were small and set deep into thick stone walls. The floor was packed earth covered in places by worn rugs that might have been colorful once, decades ago. There was a wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, a shelf holding a few battered pots and dishes, and absolutely nothing else that might be considered furniture or comfort, or evidence that human beings actually lived here by choice. Catherine stood in the doorway, her ruined boots still caked with mud, and felt the full weight of what she'd done settle over her shoulders like a sodden cloak. "It's not much," William said behind her, his voice carefully neutral, "but it's dry, mostly." Catherine wanted to laugh, wanted to cry, wanted to run back down the hillside and throw herself on her mother's mercy and beg to be allowed to marry the tobacco-stained lord, or the one with the solicitor, or even the one who'd wanted to examine her teeth. At least Go's prisons came with servants and proper roofs and floors that weren't made of dirt. Instead, she stepped inside. The first week passed in a strange, suspended reality. William insisted she take the bed while he fashioned himself a pallet by the fire, and Catherine was too exhausted to argue beyond a token protest.
She slept deeply those first nights, the kind of sleep that came from walking 5 miles in inadequate boots and burning every bridge behind you. During the days, she learned the brutal arithmetic of survival without servants. Fire needed constant attention or it died. Water had to be carried from the stream a quarter mile down the hill. Food didn't appear on plates by magic. It required planning and effort, and a knowledge of cooking that Catherine had never needed to possess. Her first attempt at making porridge resulted in a pot of gray sludge that even William, with his apparent ability to eat anything, regarded with visible doubt. Her second attempt was only marginally better. By the third day, Catherine had blisters on her hands from hauling water and feeding the fire. By the fifth, she'd managed to produce something resembling edible bread, though it had the texture of stone and tasted faintly of ash. By the seventh, she'd stopped wincing every time she knelt to tend the fire or carried the heavy water bucket up from the stream. There was something grimly satisfying about it, she discovered, about doing work and seeing immediate results, even if those results were just a pot of stew that didn't taste like boots. At Glenross, she'd spent her days arranging flowers and practicing needlework and being decorative. Here, if she didn't work, she didn't eat. The equation was brutal and clarifying. William worked on repairs to the cottage, though Catherine suspected he was inventing half of them to avoid the awkwardness of too much proximity. They spoke politely to each other, like strangers sharing a coach, never quite sure how much honesty their arrangement allowed. At night, Catherine would lie in the narrow bed and listen to William breathing by the fire, and wonder who exactly she'd married, wonder what she'd become, wonder if freedom was supposed to feel quite so much like drowning. Catherine woke on the 8th night to the sound of screaming. Not quite screaming, she realized as her heart hammered against her ribs, more like gasping, the desperate sound of someone drowning in air. She sat up in the narrow bed, disoriented in the darkness, and saw William's silhouette thrashing by the dying fire. He was still asleep. His body jerked against the pallet, one arm flung out as if warding off a blow, his breathing ragged and panicked. In the dim orange glow from the embers, Catherine could see the sweat on his face, the way his lips moved around words she couldn't hear. She should wake him. The thought came automatically, along with the impulse to help, but something held her back. Some instinct that said approaching a man trapped in whatever hell he was reliving might be dangerous for them both. Instead, she watched as William fought his invisible battle, his hands clenching and unclenching, his head turning side to side as if searching for escape. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Then, suddenly, he jerked awake, sitting up so abruptly Catherine flinched. For a moment, William stared into the darkness, his breathing still harsh, his posture rigid with tension. Then, slowly, incrementally, she watched him remember where he was, watched the soldier fade and the beggar return, though now Catherine wasn't certain which one was the disguise. He didn't turn toward the bed to see if he'd woken her, just added wood to the fire with shaking hands and sat staring into the flames until his breathing steadied. Catherine pretended to be asleep. In the morning, Catherine looked at William differently, really looked, past the wild beard and the patched clothing, to what lay beneath. The scars were more extensive than she'd initially noticed. The obvious one on his cheek, yes, but also smaller ones on his hands, his forearms, the side of his neck. The kind of scars that came from violence, from warfare, from a life lived on the edge of survival. His hands told their own story. Calloused, yes, but not from farm work or smithing. These were different calluses, the kind that came from gripping weapons, from hard marching, from work that destroyed the body in specific military ways. He noticed how he moved through the cottage with careful awareness, never turning his back to the door, always positioning himself where he could see both the entrance and the windows. How he startled at sudden sounds, his body tensing before his mind could catch up and tell him there was no danger. How he ate quickly, efficiently, like someone who'd learned that meals were temporary luxuries that might be interrupted at any moment. "You were a soldier," Catherine said one morning, the words emerging before she could reconsider them. William's jaw stilled over the pot he was mending. For a long moment he didn't respond, and Catherine thought perhaps he'd simply ignore her observation, pretend she hadn't spoken. Then, quietly, "Yes." "Where?" "Afghanistan, the Punjab, other places that don't matter now." Catherine stirred the porridge, watching the gray sludge bubble and thinking about all the things William hadn't told her when they'd made their arrangement, all the careful omissions that now seemed less like deception and more like self-preservation. "How long?" 8 years. His voice was flat, carefully empty of emotion. I came back 6 months ago, or what was left of me did. Catherine understood then with sudden clarity why William had been crouched by a fountain eating scraps when she'd found him, why a man with educated handwriting and alert intelligence was living in a collapsing cottage on the edge of nowhere. He wasn't just poor, he was broken, or trying desperately not to be, and the cottage was less a home than a place to hide while he figured out which pieces of himself might still fit together. "The nightmares," Catherine said, not quite a question. William's jaw tightened. "I'll sleep outside if they disturb you." "That's not what I meant." "What did you mean then?" Catherine didn't have an answer, or rather she had several answers, none of which she knew how to articulate. That she understood running from things that wanted to consume you, that his nightmares were at least honest, unlike the waking nightmares she'd fled, and perhaps they were both more damaged than either had admitted when they'd made their desperate bargain in the village square. "Just that you're not what I expected," she said finally. William's laugh was bitter. "Neither am I, Lady Catherine. Just Catherine. Just William, then." They worked in silence after that, but something had shifted, some acknowledgement that they were both pretending to be simpler than they were, both hiding from pasts that refused to stay buried.
The fire had burned down to embers when William finally spoke. They'd been sitting in companionable silence for the better part of an hour, Catherine mending one of William's shirts with stitches that were improving from disastrous to merely inadequate. William carving something from a piece of wood with careful precision. Outside, rain hammered against the cottage roof, finding the leak in the corner with unerring accuracy. The bucket pinged rhythmically in the darkness. "I need to tell you something," William said, his knife stilling against the wood. Catherine looked up from her mending. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, something that made her set down the shirt and give him her full attention. William stared into the fire for a long moment, and Catherine watched the orange light play across his scarred face. He looked older suddenly, or perhaps just tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "My name isn't William Fraser," he said finally. Catherine's hands went still in her lap. "All right. It's James Alexander Mackenzie." He paused, and Catherine heard him take a breath that sounded like it cost him something. "The Duke of Strathmore." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible. Catherine stared at him, waiting for the joke, for the punchline that would make this make sense. But William, James, just sat there, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the fire as if he couldn't bear to watch her reaction. "You're lying," Catherine said, though even as she spoke, she knew he wasn't. "I wish I were." Catherine's mind raced, trying to reconcile the beggar by the fountain with a duke, trying to match the man who'd eaten scraps from a wooden bowl with one of the wealthiest landowners in Scotland. It was impossible, except it wasn't, because suddenly everything made sense in a horrible, clarifying way. The educated handwriting, the way he spoke when he forgot to roughen his accent, the scars that came from military service, because of course the Duke of Strathmore's son would have been an officer, not a common foot soldier. The careful watchfulness that came not from poverty, but from being someone people wanted things from. "You let me think you were a beggar," Catherine said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I didn't lie. You made assumptions. You were crouched by a fountain eating scraps." "Because I chose to be." James finally looked at her, and there was something raw in his face. "Because I'd rather starve as myself than suffocate as the Duke of Strathmore." Catherine stood abruptly, her mending falling to the floor forgotten. She couldn't sit still, couldn't breathe properly in the small cottage that suddenly felt even smaller. "Do you have any idea what I gave up, what I destroyed to marry you?" "Yes." James' voice was quiet but firm. "You destroyed your life to escape being sold to a title and a fortune, and I destroyed mine to escape being one." The truth of it hit Catherine like cold water. She stopped pacing, turned to stare at him. "How long have you been living like this?" 6 months. Since I came back from Afghanistan and realized I couldn't stomach the thought of returning to Strathmore House, to the estates and the responsibilities, and the endless parade of people who wanted something from me. My family thinks I died in the Punjab. There was a battle, confusion, missing bodies. I let them believe it.
You let your family think you're dead? I let them mourn a son who never really existed. James stood, moving to the window where rain streaked down the glass. The heir they wanted, the duke they needed, that person died long before the battle did. What came back was something else, something that couldn't fit into those clothes anymore. Catherine's anger warred with understanding. She thought about Emily, about Glen Ross, about the suffocating weight of expectations and duty, about how she'd been willing to destroy everything to escape it. "So, we're both frauds?" Catherine said, finally. James turned from the window. "Both fugitives, at least. You married me for my 43 pounds when you own half of Scotland? I married you because you looked at me like a person, not a title, because you were brave enough to burn your life down for freedom." His voice softened. "Because I thought perhaps we could both stop running if we ran together." Catherine sank back into her chair, her mind still reeling. "What happens now? Do you go back? Reclaim your title? Do you want to return to your mother? Apologize and beg her to find you another suitor? God, no. Then nothing happens. Nothing changes." James moved back to his seat by the fire, his carved wood forgotten on the floor. "We stay James and Catherine Fraser, living in a cottage with a leaking roof, being nobody in particular. Your family? They have the estate, the title and trust, everything they need. They're better off thinking me dead than dealing with the disappointment of what I actually became." Catherine looked at her husband who was a duke, who was a beggar, who was a soldier, who was apparently as desperate to escape his cage as she'd been to escape hers. The absurdity of it should have been funny. Instead, it felt like fate's cruelest joke, or perhaps its strangest mercy. "Half of Scotland," she said, shaking her head. "And a leaking roof." Alistair almost smiled. "Though I suppose now I could afford to fix it properly." "Don't you dare! I married a beggar. I'm keeping the beggar." This time Alistair did smile, real and warm, and nothing like the wild grin he'd worn in the village square. "Then I suppose we're both stuck with our choice of prison." "I suppose we are." Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the bucket continued its rhythmic ping, and two fugitives from fortune sat by the fire and laughed until they cried. Catherine woke the next morning to find James already up, standing at the window with his hands braced against the frame. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, and weak sunlight was attempting to break through the clouds. From the bed, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his spine that spoke of a sleepless night. "Are you regretting it?" Catherine asked, quietly. James turned, and in the morning light she could see the exhaustion etched in his face. "Telling you or marrying you?" "Either? Both?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine prepared herself for whatever honesty was about to shatter their fragile arrangement. Then James laughed, a sound without much humor in it. "Do you know what the truly mad part is?" James moved away from the window, running a hand through his wild hair. "I spent 8 years in the army trying to be someone real, someone who earned their position through merit instead of inheriting it through accident of birth. And the entire time I dreamed of coming home to something simple, a cottage, a piece of land, a life where nobody cared who my father was. And instead I got a bankrupt aristocrat who married me specifically because she thought I was poor. The irony isn't lost on me." Catherine stood up, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. "I destroyed my entire life to avoid marrying a wealthy man, burned every bridge, ruined my reputation, condemned myself to poverty, and I married a duke. A duke who was living like a beggar who owns half of Scotland." They stared at each other across the small cottage, and suddenly the absurdity of it crashed over Catherine like a wave. She started to laugh, helpless and slightly hysterical. William watched her with confusion that gradually shifted into something like understanding, and then he was laughing too, a sound rough and unpracticed. "We're idiots," Catherine managed between gasps. "Complete idiots," James agreed. I could have just stayed at Glen Ross and married you properly, had a fortune, a title, everything my mother wanted. I could have just gone back to Strathmore House and married any of the dozens of suitable women my family paraded in front of me before I left for the army. Instead, we both ran away to marry each other while pretending to be something we're not. Fate has a vicious sense of humor. James wiped his eyes. Catherine's laughter faded into something more complex, something that sat heavy in her chest. She looked around the cottage, at the packed earth floor, the leaking roof, the mismatched furniture that was slowly becoming familiar. Then she looked at James, still standing by the window in his patched coat, still looking more like a beggar than a duke, despite everything she now knew. "The difference," she said slowly, "is that we chose this." James grew still. "What? You said yourself you could have gone back to Strathmore House, reclaimed your title, your estates, your position, but you chose to let them think you were dead, chose to live in a falling-down cottage and eat scraps by a fountain rather than return to that life. And I chose to walk 5 miles in drawing-room boots to marry a stranger rather than let your mother sell you to the highest bidder." "Exactly." Catherine stood, moving to where James stood by the window. Outside, the valley stretched towards the mountains, green and gray and beautiful in its indifference to their small human dramas. "So, what now? Do we can't go back to our old lives? But we don't have to stay here either. I could access funds, find us somewhere better." "With what money?" Catherine interrupted. "William Fraser the Beggar has 43 pounds to his name. The Duke of Strathmore is dead, remember?" James turned to look at her, something like hope dawning in his winter sea eyes. "You want to stay?" "I want to stay," Catherine confirmed. "Not because I have to, not because I'm trapped or desperate or out of options, but because this," she gestured around the cottage, at the bucket catching leaks and the fire that needed constant attention
and the narrow bed they took turns sleeping in. "This is ours. We chose it. Both of us." "It's still a prison," James said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "It's our prison. That's what I told you in the village square, remember? That the difference was choice." James was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine watched emotions she couldn't quite name play across his scarred face. Then slowly, he smiled. Not the wild grin of the beggar or the careful expression of a duke, but something genuine and unguarded and entirely his own. "Then I suppose," he said, "we should fix that leak properly, if we're staying." "We're staying," Catherine said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones like warmth. "But you're not fixing it alone. I'm learning." "You're terrible at repairs." "I'm terrible at everything. That's never stopped me before." Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, and 2 fugitives from fortune stood together in their falling-down cottage and didn't regret a single choice that had brought them there. The letter arrived 3 weeks after James's confession. Catherine recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, the sharp, precise script that had filled her childhood with instructions and corrections and impossible expectations. The village postmaster had delivered it personally, eyeing Catherine with the kind of curiosity that meant everyone in Brower had discussed the mysterious Mrs. Fraser and her strange marriage at length. Catherine held the letter for a long moment before breaking the seal. James watched from across the table, his hand still on the bread he'd been slicing, his expression carefully neutral. Inside, Emily's words were exactly what Catherine expected. Rage first, expressed in language so cutting Catherine could feel each word like a physical blow. Then desperation, thinly veiled as concern. Then finally, the offer Catherine had known would come eventually. Lord Carrington was still interested. The marriage could be annulled on grounds of Catherine's obvious mental instability. She could come home, resume her proper place, make amends for this temporary madness. The Thornhill name could still be salvaged. Catherine's future could still be secured. All she had to do was admit her mistake and return. "What does it say?" James asked quietly. Catherine read it aloud, her voice steady despite the nausea rising in her throat.
When she finished, she set the letter down on the table between them, like evidence at a trial. "You could go back," James said. "The marriage hasn't been consummated. An annulment would be simple enough, especially with your mother's connections. Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. This is your life, Catherine." "It's our life." Catherine met his eyes across the table. "Or have the past 3 weeks meant nothing?" James's jaw tightened. "They've meant everything. That's why I'm telling you that you don't have to stay trapped here with me. You married a beggar to escape your mother. You got a duke instead. That's not what you signed up for." "I signed up for a man who understood what it meant to want out. A man who'd rather starve as himself than suffocate as someone else's expectation. That's still you, isn't it? Whether you're William Fraser or James Mackenzie." "Yes." "Then the name doesn't matter." James stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he'd stood the morning after his confession. "But it does matter, Catherine, because I have resources you don't. I could access funds, buy us a proper house, give you the life you were supposed to have." "Stop." Catherine rose, moving to stand beside him. "I don't want the life I was supposed to have. That's the entire point. I destroyed that life deliberately." "You destroyed it to escape poverty and forced marriage. I can give you comfort without the cage." "And then what? We live in a fine house on your dead duke's money? Pretend to be simple country gentry while hiding who you really are? That's just another kind of lie, James." He turned to face her, and Catherine saw the conflict written plainly across his features. The duke who'd been trained to provide and protect, warring with the soldier who'd learned that sometimes survival meant letting go. "There's a second letter," Catherine said quietly. "One I need to write." She sat back down at the table and pulled out the paper and ink they'd purchased from the village shop. Her hand was steady as she began to write, conscious of James watching over her shoulder. "Mother, I will not be returning to Glen Ross. I will not be seeking an annulment. I will not be resuming my place in Edinburgh society or making amends for choices I do not regret. You raised me to understand that marriage was a transaction, that love was a luxury we couldn't afford, that security meant selling myself to the highest bidder. You were wrong about all of it. I am Catherine Fraser now, not Thornhill, not Lady, just Catherine. And I am happier in a cottage with a leaking roof than I ever was in a manor with a family name worth more than my personhood. Do not write again. Catherine." She signed it with a flourish and set down the pen. James was silent behind her, and when Catherine finally turned to look at him, she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. "You're certain?" he asked. "Are you? Because there's nothing stopping you from reclaiming your title, from going back to Strathmore House and resuming your position. You could have everything back." "Everything I ran from." "Exactly." James moved to the table, pulling out the chair across from Catherine and sitting down heavily. "My family has a solicitor in Edinburgh. I could send word through intermediaries, arrange for funds without revealing I'm alive." "No," Catherine agreed. "Just William and Catherine Fraser. 2 people choosing their own prison. It's not much of a life. It's our life. That makes it everything." Outside, spring was beginning to assert itself despite the lingering cold. Green shoots were emerging in the valley below. Birds were returning to nest in the eaves. The world was renewing itself with the kind of careless optimism that came from not knowing or caring about dukes or ladies or the social structures they'd both abandoned. James squeezed Catherine's hand once, then released it to tend the fire. Catherine sealed her letter to Emily with wax and set it aside for the postmaster's next visit. Neither of them spoke about the futures they'd rejected or the lives they might have led. They had made their choice, and in the choosing, they had found something worth more than titles or estates or the approval of families who'd never truly seen them at all. They had found each other, and themselves, and that, in the end, was the only fortune that mattered.